I wanted to just have a quick look at the protests of 1968, as I think this is one of the big changing points in political agency, as it was the first kind of globalized political change with like what was known at the time, or theorized slightly later, as the diffusion effect, where the protests were going beyond the individual governments and going kind of across the globe. And I wanted to highlight these protests in 1968 because there was varying demands. Across America, there was the civil rights movement and the student protests for changing the curriculum. In the UK and France, there were protests against universities and university expansion. In Eastern Europe, there were protests against censorship and changing academic practices. There were protests against nuclear weapons and protests against the Vietnam War. And why I bring this up is because the themes identified for the political change in these protests were war, environmental change, and racial relations, and of course changes in university space. This, I argue, is the same as many of the protests that have come in recent years. And so, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests, the walkouts for the climate against the environment, and the Israel-Palestine protests. However, what we're seeing here is that these protests are not necessarily seen in the same light. They're not seen as kind of liberating as they may have been before. And I don't disagree that there are differences. I want to argue that the differences are that because Gen Z have a different idea of where power lies and accountability. Because I think the protests in 1968 were very much directed against the government, and they saw it as a way to create, they were quite hopeful of political change. However, Gen Z are not seen as doing this. Their protests are often belittled and kind of pushed down, and not actually being able to increase political liberation for their generation, but actually decreasing it.